Hi, everybody. So we're going to talk today about IoT, privacy, and security. My name is Terry McCorkle. I work for Splunk. I've been a security researcher, penetration tester. I've worked in the security industry for about 16 years. So I've been around a little bit. Big part of my career was actually breaking into control systems and doing assessments against them, finding vulnerabilities, things like that. So I have a real interest in those systems, and now I'm on the other side of the fence trying to help secure them. So we're going to talk about just an IoT overview really quickly. Anybody here have control systems in their environment that they are aware of? Okay, a couple. So we'll talk a little bit about industrial control systems, the Internet of Things, what those systems are, and where you see them. They're a lot more popular than people think. We'll talk about some of the security trends that we're seeing in those industries. What are people actually seeing attackers do? We're going to talk about some use case examples, so you can kind of picture how you might use those technologies in the future. And we'll talk about the privacy concerns that those systems present. So big data is everywhere. You hear big data on the news, you hear big data everywhere. And the reason you're hearing that is because you have all these computers now that basically run the world, right? So everybody owns a computer, everybody owns a phone. All these things produce data. So in a enterprise, you have everything from messaging to management of the servers, things like that, and you have data flowing all over the place. And people have figured out how to collect that data and use it to make sure that the systems stay up and running, that they're doing what they're supposed to do for security, things like that. But there's another side of the world too, where you have all these industrial control systems. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those systems are, but this is kind of a different world where you have sensors and pumps and valves and things that actually have a physical impact on the world. So those also produce data. A quick kind of overview of the industries when you start breaking down what industries actually exist. So if you hear the word SCADA, has everybody heard of SCADA before? So a lot of people think about SCADA and they think, okay, that's like a factory. Well, SCADA is really the long haul stuff. It's the stuff that's spread over long, wide areas. They use like GSM, they use wireless technologies to communicate with things out in the field, like power plants, power grids, gas pipelines, things like that, where they actually need to monitor to make sure that those systems are up and running, they're doing what they're supposed to do, okay? So when you think SCADA, think more of the long haul monitoring. Distributed control systems are going to be like factories. If you have a shipping warehouse, if you have some automated manufacturing process, if you're making bottles of soda, you have some kind of a distributed control system in those environments, okay? And as we're moving into the future, we're seeing more and more smart cities, smart buildings, things like that, right? Where all of the homes, the buildings, the processes that go on in those buildings, air conditioning, power, access controls, all those sort of things are actually now getting interconnected so they can have one picture of what their property looks like. And they do that for many reasons, but what that does is that gives an attacker one central point of attack as well. So there's a lot of good things and there's a lot of other things that people may not necessarily think about. And there's consumer technology. Everybody's familiar with consumer technology. You have Fitbits and you have the new watches that everybody wears, and it tracks your heart rate, and it tracks where you're at, and it tracks how far you've walked, and all these different data sets. And that data gets sent out to the cloud, right? So when you hear IoT or industrial control systems, just kind of put them in the right spot. So we have industrial control systems, the Internet of Things. A lot of that terminology kind of gets mixed together these days. So if we're talking about industrial control systems, there's a big difference between a traditional computer system. It's not a traditional computer system. An industrial control system has embedded controllers. They have things called HMIs, which are human-machine interfaces, that let them actually visualize what the processes in that environment are doing. Okay, so they'll have something that shows the pumps, the valves, what they're doing, what the temperature may be, something like that. They have processors for motors. How fast is the motor spinning? Can you make that motor spin faster? And then you have GSM technology, which lets you communicate over long haul distances. Okay? So when you hear industrial control systems, you're thinking more along those lines. And when it comes to actually securing an industrial control system, you have to look at several things. There's historians, there's HMIs, there's these controllers. These are things that most people never see, but they make the world work. Okay? They're what gives you power. They're what gives you water. These are the things that make the world run. There's engineering workstations in those environments where they actually design those technologies. They create the software that runs on those PLCs. They create the software that runs on the HMIs. So it's literally a plan for what those environments look like. As an attacker, as somebody who used to do penetration testing for companies, that was my target because I would learn everything about their environment. I'd know the code they were running. I'd know what their environment looked like. So if you have these systems, think about that. Think about what you're doing with those. Embedded systems are a little different. Okay? A computer you may buy, a consumer computer you may buy, you may have it for a couple of years. I know in the public sector it may be different. Maybe you have it for 15 years. But in the embedded devices, they're designed to be in place for 15 years. They're actually designed to be in place for up to 30 years, 40 years. And they're designed to run 24/7. So those environments are always working. So what they do is they use embedded technology. So it's different than a traditional computer. And that embedded technology can't be upgraded or updated as much as other systems can. So it's not as easy to maintain them. Now, some of the newer technologies, they've started figuring this out. They're getting better at it. But in the past, and there's still a lot of them out there, there's systems that just don't get upgraded. They don't get patched. And then there's network communication. So if you're looking at securing one of those environments, those are the things you're going to look at. And what about IoT? All right? IoT is this new emerging technology. We've got cars that are smart. We've got homes that are smart. We're wearing health devices. All right? We have a cell phone that's as powerful as my computer. All right? So and technology is just continuing to evolve. So if you think about this from both a privacy perspective as well as a security perspective, what kinds of things are being done to secure those environments? So what kinds of things are done to protect the privacy? So when you look at the threats that are out there, these are what we use as an example of common attackers, right? Maybe they're cyber criminals. Maybe they're looking to commit fraud. Maybe they're looking to steal identities or something like that. Maybe they're a nation state that's actually trying to just gain data. They want to understand how a community works. They want to understand how they can disrupt that. They want to understand a lot of different things about that in case they ever need to. And then you have malicious insiders. And the one thing I've noticed is that you can always tell a cyber criminal because they wear hats, right? I've never worn one, so. If you look at the headlines and what people are actually doing, what attackers are actually doing, we've got a lot of different things, right? So they're going into factories, they're turning off factories. And they came in through somebody's email. They sent an email to a worker, just like anybody else. They came into that worker's computer, and then they went immediately after the control system environment and turned off the steel plant in the middle of the day, okay? Now, if you can imagine what a steel plant's doing with molten steel, if that process gets turned off, it's not a good thing. So attackers are getting smart. They know what they're targeting. They target nuclear facilities. They're targeting what we consider critical infrastructure, okay? Things that make the world go round. But they're also looking at things like how do they break into houses? What can they break into somebody's refrigerator? Can they use that and implant a bot on it that can be used to attack somebody else? So, as we become more connected, we have to think about these things. As a company that actually has industrial control systems, excuse me, they think about several things. So they have a lot of different concerns when it comes to making sure that their systems are up and running. They want to make sure their employees are safe. right? They want to make sure that they're meeting compliance guidelines, because a lot of these organizations actually have compliance guidelines. They have things that say you must protect your data. They have things that say you must have a certain amount of uptime. If you don't, you get fined, things like that. And they want to protect information leakage. Now, they have a lot of challenges because there is older technology. They don't necessarily have all the logging capabilities that a traditional computer has, right? They don't necessarily have the reporting capabilities that a normal data center has. Things like that. There's a lot of times data silos they have to deal with. But we're talking about privacy, not security here. So what is it that people are concerned about, right? If you have devices everywhere and you want to have your life online, who's protecting that data? Who's actually monitoring to make sure that people aren't stealing that data? Currently there's not a lot of regulation around what an organization does with data unless it's medical data, right? So in the medical industry we have HIPAA, right? Banking industry, they have GLBA, things like that. But when it comes to putting things out on the internet, what are the requirements to protect consumer data? As we become more and more connected, it's going to be interesting. So if you're going to secure something, you can collect all the data about it, you can enrich it, right? This is how an organization does it. They collect it, they look at things like what's going on the network, who's logging into these systems, so what are the devices doing? If they have HMIs, they can see who's logging into those HMIs, who's working there. Is the operations working correctly, right? So as an industrial control system facility, they can actually collect all this data and do something really valuable with it to make sure that everything's up and working the way it's supposed to. But there's actually a lot of use cases you can do with this data. It's not just from a security standpoint. So once you've collected this data, you can look at it from a lot of different use cases. What's your use case? All right? Do you want to measure and control things? Do you want to make sure that you have a safety and compliance guideline? Do you want to use it to be more efficient? Do you want to use that data to actually run better? If there's organizations that are out there that are collecting, for example, building data across their entire plant, and they're using that to negotiate how much power they use, because they know exactly how much power they use. So they can negotiate with the power company to save money, right? So there's a lot of different use cases, all right? We start getting to people, right? What are the future use cases, right? What are companies going to start doing once that data is available, right? So as an organization, if that data is available, it's not regulated, who knows what the future can hold. The other organizations are collecting that data and they're monitoring robots, right? So robots run all the time, they're constantly moving. This organization uses the data to actually look at the tread depth on their machines, because if the tread gets a little lower, they don't make the correct turns, they end up making errors, right? Other organizations are using that data to look at their pipelines, right? They're actually collecting the data, they're looking to make sure that they're compliant, they're doing the things they're supposed to do. They have to respond, they're required by regulation to respond within 5 minutes if there's ever anything wrong with that environment. Other organizations are using fleet data. I don't know if very many of you have seen this, but you can go talk to your insurance company. They'll send you a dongle just like this, and you can plug it into your car, and they'll let you basically have a discount based on your good driving habits, right? The question then becomes, if you're a fleet, you can do that and you can collect all this data and you can know exactly how your cars are performing. But as a person, if you send this data, what can you actually get out of that? What are you actually sending to an organization when you opt into something like that? This is what the raw data looks like. It looks like a bunch of ones and zeros, It's kind of tough to read as a person, right? But if you break it out and you tell something what those fields are, right? Now you have things like, has the car ever been in a crash? What's the latitude, longitude? Where's that car at? Right, where's it at right now? And this is sent real time. How fast is it going? Things like that. So that data then all gets sent. There's even things in here like, is the door open or not? Now, organizations have used this data. For example, they'll monitor their fleets, and they'll be able to tell, like, if the RPMs are different than usual. Maybe it's low in oil. Maybe there's something wrong with it. But they'll be able to get it in for maintenance. But now people are plugging these into their cars as well. So this is an example of an organization that actually uses all that data, creates an awesome spreadsheet, an awesome visualization. But this is what they're able to do with it. They're able to backtrack exactly where their car goes. Where did it stop? When did the door open? How long were they there? So this is the sort of data that's now being collected by a lot of different organizations. If you start looking at, an overall city, right? This is a kind of a weird representation of a smart city, right? But you have these little blocks, right? Smart homes, right? You're collecting, people are starting to get to the point where newer technologies allow them to basically view their home at any time, right? Their home can tell them when they're using too much power. Their home can tell them, exactly like when they're home, turn on the lights, turn off the lights, turn on the heat, turn off the heat, things like that, right? You can program all of that. And while that's a really good thing, where's that data going and who's protecting it, right? We're getting to the point, and not necessarily in the States yet, but there's smart shopping carts. There's things where your shopping cart will automatically collect the data for what you're purchasing as you walk through the store, right? Now, in the States, we started with things like cards that you slide for your supermarket so that they can track and send you coupons, right? But that is data. And when you start combining all these different things like health, and then you drive down the road and you have toll systems that are keeping track of exactly where you go, exactly how long when do you go there. They know exactly when you drive down the street. So you're collecting all this data, and as we get more and more in this technology world, you can start imagining what the privacy concerns might be, right? Like who's going to look at that data? Who's going to protect that data? Who's regulating that data? Currently, unless it's healthcare, I don't know that very many things are regulated. Does anybody know? Are there regulations out there? Maybe somebody in this room knows. But I couldn't find any. Some of the interesting things, so we're not just talking about wearables. There's companies out there that make pills now that you can swallow that track like your digestive health and your body, like from the inside. So we're not just talking about somebody that wears a watch. Like it might get to the point that your doctor says, here, swallow this pill and I'm going to monitor you for a week, right? So the technology is becoming really incredible. And I'm actually kind of excited to see it because who knows where we're going to be in 20 years. But from a consumer side, who's protecting the privacy of those users? Who's monitoring to see who's actually using those systems? So a couple takeaways, and I went really quick here, guys. I'm sorry. I was supposed to give you 45 minutes, but I guess we'll have a lot of time for questions. So if we look at this, we have IoT devices, right? They have very valuable data. So from a consumer perspective, how do you want to use that data? What do you want to do, right? It's beneficial, right? It's beneficial to all of us. It makes the world run better, right? But the big questions are who's protecting it, or who's collecting the data? Who's actually protecting it, and what kind of regulations are in place? Because a lot of organizations aren't going to do everything they need to protect that data unless they're asked to. And we as users have to ask them to do that. And how should it be protected? Who's monitoring to see who sees that data? Right? Who's watching the watchers, basically? So I really meant to make that a longer talk. I apologize. I guess I talk fast. But that's basically my presentation. Any questions? No questions.
So on the control systems, no one's going to place, obviously. The security safeguards on those are pretty secure, or is it an ongoing battle?
So good question. So he asked on the industrial control systems, are those systems very secure? Who's actually going to battle on those? So industrial control systems actually have, depending on the industry you're in, there's regulations around it called critical infrastructure protection. So a lot of organizations like the power grids, transportation, gas and power, oil, banking, they all have control system requirements. So anytime you're talking about those, they have the critical infrastructure protection acts that have them protect that. Now, from an organizational perspective, if you just have, for example, a bottling facility or a shipping facility, something like that, there's not necessarily any regulation that requires that. The systems, the newer systems are getting better about being upgradable, things like that. But IT kind of evolves separately than the industrial control systems. Industrial control systems are actually around first. All right, so, but IT just leaps and bounds because consumers used it, right? So IT kind of got left in the dust, or ICS kind of got left in the dust. So a lot of the systems are older. They're not necessarily maintained like they, from a security perspective. You know, companies have a hard time monitoring them, and they're kept in separate environments. They like to think there's silos between them. So they'll say, oh no, that's a totally separate environment. I've been doing assessments against those systems for years, and I have yet to find one that's actually completely separate. So you just have to find the right place to get in.
Well, once it's hooked up to the internet,
right.
so unless you have a standalone system.
Right. So if it's hooked up to the internet, a lot of, when you talk about true industrial control systems, not necessarily hooked up to the internet, right? They'll be separate. Here's an interesting thing. So as part of my research, I started looking at building management systems. And most people don't think about it, but when you walk into your building, you badge in, right? You get in. When you walk into your office, the lights come on, right? The heat automatically turns off at 8 o'clock at night, right? There's all these different interconnected systems. So building management systems are actually, a lot of them are becoming centrally managed, right? So you have one, basically a computer, an embedded system that you connect all these other devices up to, and it gives somebody a central point to control those systems, right? So the interesting thing I found is most organizations don't think about that because they don't actually maintain it. That's maintained by a systems integrator, somebody who's actually hired to install and maintain that system, because it's not a traditional computer system. You wouldn't ask your IT guy to go maintain this system, basically. So what the integrations people have done is they actually would go install their own internet link, and they would have it so that there's a link inside from this building management system and a direct link to the internet so that they can get in and remotely manage it. So as part of my research, we went out and we actually identified 50,000 buildings that are on the internet. Okay, and that was everything from hospitals to fire departments to schools to big buildings that are in the middle of facilities, banks, the government facilities, everything. Because the integrators don't necessarily, what was that? Target. Yep, I wasn't going to bring that up, but the point is, the third-party integrators actually maintain and install. They install and maintain a lot of these systems, right? So it's not always a okay, I'm just going to treat this as a normal system, because it's not. They're different types of programming, different ways to protect it. They just never really focused on the security side of it. So
the devices they're hooking up to the building management system, they're not. The system doesn't identify it as the correct device being hooked up, so somebody can tap into that device or replace it.
no, it identifies it correctly. It's just the integrator doesn't necessarily think about it from a security perspective, right? To them, it's not a big deal if, and they'll have a shared password across all their customers too. So that way their technicians can go maintain any of their customers at any time, right? It makes sense from their perspective, right? They've never looked at it necessarily from a security perspective, especially for that organization. Now, as an attacker, I can go in, target that system, get into the building management system, use that to hop into their traditional network. Actually, we did an assessment once where the customer was like, I want you to take it as far as you can. So we unlocked their door at 8 o'clock at night, turned off their IP cameras, walked into their data center, and at that point they said, you can stop. But the point is as an organization, you may not think you have these systems, but these embedded systems, they're literally everywhere. When you walk around and start looking at the panels that are out there, like that's what these systems are. They're everywhere. You had a question over here?
In these embedded systems, you have 20 or 30-year-old operating systems on their cache.
Right.
Other than perimeter security, are there tools being developed or software tools or whatever solutions for protecting those type of things?
Good question. So his question was, since the operating systems on these control systems are often 30 years old, what kinds of technologies are actually being created to help prevent access or to help protect those systems? There are organizations that are focusing on that, right? There's some companies, for example, that have created technology that can sit on top of an existing piece of hardware, and it can use temperature and other things to know exactly what the CPU is doing, and actually read what's going on a CPU. And it can detect malware on an embedded system, right? So there are some really smart people looking at this. Like, I can't imagine writing something like that, but people are doing it. Now, how quickly that's going to catch on, how much funds are given to an organization to go procure things like that's not catching on as fast as the technology that's there to actually help. So the technology exists, people are working on it, very smart people are working on it, but a lot of organizations aren't necessarily thinking about protecting that data like they do a traditional computer system. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. We're, I think everybody was given cards, but we're having a Gov Day coming up here in Sacramento. So if you have any questions, there's people outside the door that can help with that.